The chamber was tense, a place where power usually pressed down with suffocating weight. Cameras were locked in, every lens hungry to capture the slightest shift in expression. Judge Amul Thapar leaned forward, his voice sharpened like a blade, meant to cut through hesitation. He thought he had Jasmine Crockett cornered. He thought this would be the moment he broke her composure. But what followed was the moment that stunned not just the room, but the millions who would later watch in disbelief. Thapar's words dripped with condescension, wrapped in the authority of the robe he wore. He asked his question, laced with the kind of smugness that suggested he had already written the ending. For a split second, silence gripped the chamber. Everyone waited for Jasmine Crockett to fold, to stumble, to become yet another voice drowned beneath the booming authority of the bench. But then, she looked up, calm, steady, her eyes locked onto his with the quiet force of someone who had been underestimated. Her entire life and had grown stronger because of it. And then she said it. The sentence that ricocheted across the chamber, a verbal lightning strike that no one saw coming. Judge, with all due respect, I don't answer to arrogance. I answer to the people. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters blinked, stunned, already racing to write down her words. For a moment, the air itself seemed to freeze. The balance of power had shifted in a heartbeat. The judge's polished certainty cracked as the echo of her words rolled like thunder through the chamber. Nobody expected her to say this. Nobody expected a woman, often dismissed as too fiery, too blunt, too unapologetic, to turn the tables so effortlessly. But Jasmine Crockett had done more than respond. She had flipped the entire exchange. And as the camera zoomed in on Thapar's tightened jaw and Crockett's unwavering calm, the truth was undeniable. This wasn't just another hearing. This was a clash of dignity against arrogance, truth against performance. And in that very first moment, it was clear this was a story America would not forget. But what led to this explosive confrontation? To understand why her words landed with such force, we have to rewind to the stakes that made this showdown inevitable. To truly grasp the magnitude of what unfolded that day, you have to understand the backdrop. This wasn't just another congressional hearing, and it wasn't simply a clash of personalities. At stake was something far larger, the integrity of justice itself, and the question of who gets to define dignity in America's most sacred halls of power. Judge Amul Thapar had carved out a reputation for himself long before this moment. To his allies, he was sharp, disciplined, a legal mind who never flinched. But to his critics, he was something else entirely. A man whose courtroom presence carried a whiff of arrogance, who spoke down rather than across, who wielded authority less like a servant of the law and more like a gatekeeper protecting it from the very people it was meant to serve. Time and again, whispers grew into headlines about his dismissive tone, his habit of cornering those who dared to challenge him. In the eyes of many, he symbolized a strain of power that looked down instead of lifting up. Enter Jasmine Crockett. Rising fast in Congress, she had already become a name impossible to ignore. Her speeches carried fire but also precision. Her voice equal parts lawyer and advocate, polished by years of standing on the front lines for communities too often silenced. She wasn't there to play by the old rules. She was there to rewrite them. For her supporters, she embodied the unapologetic fight for representation. Proof that you didn't have to conform to be effective. That truth, told boldly, was more powerful than any title or robe. So when their paths crossed in that chamber, the tension was already baked in. The country was watching not just to individuals, but to worldviews. On one side, the polished judge, cloaked in institutional authority. On the other, the congresswoman who refused to bow, carrying with her the voices of those long excluded from such spaces. The stakes stretched far beyond that room. This was about how America defines respect, whether it's something demanded by power or something earned by truth. It was about whether women of color in positions of leadership would be allowed to speak without being cut off, diminished, or reduced to stereotypes. It was about a clash between entitlement and authenticity, between posturing and principle. For Thapar, this was supposed to be routine, a moment to assert control, to remind everyone who held the gavel. For Crockett, it was another test in a career defined by obstacles designed to silence her. And for the audience, both in the chamber and across the nation, it was a chance to see whose vision of America would prevail. The room was heavy with expectation as Thapar began his line of questioning, his tone sharp, his words calculated to force Crockett into a corner. But she did not flinch. Each syllable he delivered was met with her steady gaze. As if she were reading not just his words, but the history behind them, the long shadow of authority that had tried to keep voices like hers out of the conversation. This was no longer about one exchange. It was about dignity standing ity with arrogance, about truth daring to push back against the smugness of power. The atmosphere crackled with the kind of energy that makes history, the kind that signals to every listener, something bigger than politics is happening here. And then it happened. The collision, the spark. Jasmine Crockett's refusal to bow met Judge Thapar's expectation of dominance head-on. But the moment these two collided, sparks flew, and what happened next was unthinkable. To understand why this confrontation carried such weight, you have to know who Judge Amul Thapar is, not just the man in the row, but the persona he cultivated over years of wielding authority. On paper, his resume gleams. A federal judge, appointed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Touted as a trailblazer, and once floated as a potential Supreme Court nominee. His career path had the sheen of inevitability, a man destined to sit atop America's legal pyramid, but beneath that polished exterior lay a reputation that split observers down the middle. To his defenders, Thapar represented order, discipline, a strict adherence to the letter of the law. He projected confidence, precision, the kind of courtroom presence that left no room for hesitation. His admirers described him as a man unafraid to cut through what he saw as noise, to demand answers with surgical bluntness. But to his critics, the same qualities looked very different. Arrogance, condescension, a tendency to turn hearings into performances where he played not the impartial arbiter but the starring role. There were stories, many of them, litigants, who walked into his courtroom expecting fairness, only to be met with biting remarks that seemed less about clarifying the law and more about putting them in their place. Attorneys whispered about his interruptions, his way of framing questions, that cornered rather than clarified. He was the kind of judge who wielded the Socratic method, not as a teaching tool but as a weapon, making the other side stumble while he leaned back with the satisfaction of someone who already believed he'd won. And it wasn't just in the courtroom. Thapar had left behind sound bites in speeches and interviews that drew both applause and outrage. Critics accused him of leaning into a brand of judicial philosophy that prized rigidity over humanity, technical correctness over lived experience. He carried himself with the certainty of a man convinced he was always the smartest in the room, and perhaps, in some ways, he was. But intelligence unchecked by humility can quickly turn into something else, entitlement. That entitlement hardened into his public persona. He was in many ways untouchable, elevated by allies, protected by prestige, and praised by those who saw him as the future of conservative jurisprudence. For years, it seemed that no one could pierce the armor of confidence he wore so easily. When journalists wrote about him, they noted his charm, his polish, his ability to disarm in social settings. But they also noted the sharp edges, the moments when his questioning veered into belittlement, when his tone carried more heat than light. The image stuck. Judge Amul Thapar, the man who played the role of intellectual gladiator, striking down anyone who dared to stumble in his arena, and because of that, he grew accustomed to winning. He leaned into his reputation as the unflinching cross-examiner, the master of control. In his world, silence meant victory, hesitation meant weakness, and his word carried the final weight. But therein lay the seeds of his undoing. Because arrogance, when left unchecked, doesn't just grow, it blinds. Thapar had become so used to pushing people into corners that he forgot what happens when someone refuses to be trapped. He had grown so accustomed to holding the stage that he never considered what it would feel like when the spotlight turned against him. That was why this encounter with Jasmine Crockett was so charged. To him, she was supposed to be another figure, to dominate, another name to press into compliance beneath the gravity of his voice. But what he couldn't calculate was that Crockett was not the kind of opponent who shrinks. She was, in fact, everything he had not prepared for, fearless, unbowed, and unwilling to play by the script he had written so many times before. The higher he had climbed in arrogance, the harder his fall would be. And as the cameras rolled, that day, as the exchange began to unfold, the story was no longer about a judge displaying confidence. It was about whether confidence had slipped into hubris, and whether hubris was about to meet its reckoning. What Thapar didn't realize was that history has a way of humbling even the most polished personas, and in Jasmine Crockett, he was about to meet not just resistance, but a force strong enough to shatter the illusion of untouchability he had carried for so long. Because while he believed the chamber was his arena, it would soon become hers. Long before the cameras ever captured her stare locking onto Judge Amul Thapar, Jasmine Crockett had lived a life forged in resilience. She was not born into privilege, nor was her path a carefully paved one, lined with political benefactors. Hers was the story of a woman who carved her way forward with grit, intellect, and an unshakable belief that justice should belong to everyone, not just the few who already held power. She began her career as a lawyer, not in plush corporate offices, but in courtrooms where the clients sitting across from her table were often the ones society had discarded. They were the poor, the forgotten, the ones who could not afford the kind of legal defense that shields the wealthy from accountability. For Jasmine, those clients were not cases, they were people. She saw their humanity, their dignity, their struggles. She didn't just practice law, she lived its purpose. Her activism soon bled into her identity. She became the kind of advocate who refused to soften her voice for comfort or dilute her truth for approval. In a system that rewards those who play by the old rules, Jasmine made a career of breaking them when they no longer served the people she fought for. Courtroom after courtroom, she stood toe-to-toe with institutions that assumed she would back down. Instead, she fought harder. That fire carried her into politics. When she ran for office, few gave her a real shot. The establishment doubted, her opponents dismissed her, and commentators brushed her off as too raw, too loud, too unwilling to smooth her edges. But what those critics failed to understand was that those very edges were her strength. She wasn't there to play a role. She was there to bring the voices of her community into the halls where decisions were made. And when she won, she didn't just win for herself, she carried millions with her. In Congress, she quickly built a reputation, not for polite speeches that vanished into the ether, but for words that landed like thunder. She spoke with urgency, with conviction, with the cadence of someone who refused to let truth be buried under procedure. She didn't need to check the winds of political favor. She already knew who she represented. And that made her dangerous to those who thrived on silencing dissent. For many, she became more than just a representative. She became a symbol. Every time she refused to be interrupted, every time she refused to let condescension go unanswered, people outside the chamber felt seen. This wasn't just another politician in a tailored suit. This was a woman carrying the weight of millions, who had been told to stay quiet, to sit down, to wait their turn. Through her, they found proof that silence could be broken and that it could be broken with dignity and strength. Her rise was not without cost. She faced criticism harsher than many of her peers, attacks laced not only with political venom, but with undertones of gender and race. Commentators questioned her tone, her style, her audacity. But every insult only sharpened her resolve. For Jasmine Crockett, the message was clear. If they were trying this hard to shut her down, it meant she was hitting exactly where it mattered. It was this fire, this lived experience, that she carried with her into that hearing room with Judge Thapar. She knew what it was to be cornered. She had faced institutions bigger, older, and more entrenched than him before, and every time, she had found a way not just to stand, but to stand taller. So when Thapar leaned forward, armed with years of habitually cutting people down, he believed he was engaging just another opponent. He believed his robe, his title, his reputation, would be enough to force deference. What he could not have known was that Jasmine Crockett's entire life had been preparation for this very moment. She was not intimidated by sharp words or cold authority. She had battled systemic injustice, political dismissal, and cultural stereotypes far harsher than anything Thapar could throw her way. And she had emerged, not weakened, but stronger. That day, she carried into the chamber not just her own voice, but the echoes of every community she had fought for, every person told they didn't belong, every citizen whose dignity had been denied. She was the living embodiment of defiance and hope, and when she finally spoke, it was not only for herself, but for all of them. This was not just another politician facing off against a judge. This was the culmination of a journey defined by courage, a woman standing firm against the arrogance of power. And when Judge Thapar tried to silence her, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The hearing had settled into that deceptive rhythm, the kind where one side believes it's firmly in control. Judge Thapar, as he so often did, leaned into his confidence. His tone was measured, his words deliberate, each question crafted like a snare disguised as civility. He believed he had her exactly where he wanted her. He began with procedure, citing precedent, laying out the kind of legal jargon designed not to clarify but to confuse. He pressed her on technicalities, narrowing his questions so tightly that any answer could be twisted. His voice carried that polished authority, each syllable dropping with the weight of someone who expected obedience. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Instead of stumbling, she listened, let him finish, and then answered with precision. She was calm, unhurried, the kind of composure that throws even the sharpest interrogator off balance. Where Thapar expected hesitation, she gave him clarity. Where he expected frustration, she gave him confidence. The judge tried again. He interrupted, cut across her words, framing his next question as if it were the final nail in her argument. "Congresswoman," he said with a faint smirk, "are you suggesting you know better than the courts?" The audience stiffened. It was the kind of question designed to corner, to trap her in either arrogance or submission. But Jasmine only leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "What I'm suggesting," she replied evenly, "is that the courts don't define my duty to the people who elected me." A ripple moved through the chamber. Thapar blinked, just once, but it was enough to register. He pressed again, faster this time, as though speed might succeed where control had faltered. "Then answer this directly, yes or no. Isn't it true that by refusing, you undermine the very rule of law you claim to defend?" Now his voice had sharpened, the polish slipping, impatience edging in. The body language was clear. His shoulders tense, his posture rigid, his jaw tight. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained still. Her composure became its own weapon, a mirror reflecting his mounting frustration. She paused before responding. It wasn't hesitation, it was strategy. The pause itself commanded attention, pulling the audience closer. When she finally spoke, her words landed with unshakable weight. The rule of law is undermined not by those who question authority, judge, but by those who use authority to silence questions. The room shifted. Reporters lowered their pens for a moment, eyes widening at the subtle reversal. The trap had been exposed. She had flipped the premise, recast the accusation, and placed the burden squarely back where it belonged on him. For Thapar, this was unfamiliar territory. He leaned forward, his tone edging toward frustration. "Congresswoman, I am asking a simple question. Do you intend to answer directly, or will you continue to deflect?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his aggression. Instead, she stayed rooted in calm, her steady gaze making it clear who now held the power. "I will always answer directly," she said, "but I will never answer on terms designed to distort the truth." That was the moment the audience leaned in, every seat suddenly taut with anticipation. It wasn't just a clash of words anymore. It was posture against poise, arrogance against dignity. One man's authority was unraveling in real time, while the other's refusal to bend only made her stronger. The temperature in the room had changed. What began as a performance of control was transforming into a test of endurance. And it was Judge Thapar who was starting to show cracks. His voice had grown sharper, his interruptions more frequent, his certainty eroding with every calm rebuttal Jasmine delivered. The joust had reached its boiling point. Every question he asked now seemed less like inquiry and more like desperation. Every answer she gave seemed less like defense and more like revelation. And in the silence between their exchanges, the audience could feel it. Something historic was about to happen. But then, Jasmine Crockett delivered a line that left the entire chamber stunned. Asterisk. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words struck, the shockwave began. At first it was a ripple in the chamber, gasps, murmurs, the restless shifting of bodies who knew they'd witnessed something historic. But as the footage hit the airwaves and spilled onto timelines, that ripple became a tidal wave. Social media erupted in a frenzy, the kind that transforms a single line into a cultural landmark. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Hashtag answer to the people. Hashtag Crockett shuts down THAPAR. Hashtag Mike. Clips of the exchange spread across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Each replay capturing the precise second Thapar's composure cracked and Crockett's voice cut through with unflinching clarity. Users looped the clip, slowed it down, layered it with music, and captioned it with bold declarations. "This is how you face arrogance. Dignity always wins." Headlines followed quickly. The Washington Post. Crockett shuts down Thapar in stunning hearing exchange. CNN. Mic drop moment reverberates across Capitol. Even outlets that often dismissed or downplayed her presence could not ignore it. The story wasn't just the line itself, it was the reaction, the way it caught fire and refused to burn out. Supporters flooded her mentions with praise. Constituents called her a hero, applauding her not only for what she said but for how she said it, measured, unshaken, impossible to dismiss. Activists hailed it as a victory for representation, a moment that proved women of color could not only hold their ground in hostile arenas but redefine the terms of battle. Critics, of course, scrambled to minimize the damage. Some dismissed her words as grandstanding. Others accused her of disrespecting the judiciary. A few tried to spin the moment as inconsequential. But their pushback only highlighted how deeply her words had landed. If it truly meant nothing, why was everyone talking about it? Why did the clip keep climbing, viewed by millions before the sun even set on that day? Commentators weighed in. Pundits on cable news dissected the exchange, some with admiration, others with obvious discomfort. One host noted, "This wasn't just about two people sparring. It was about power itself, who wields it, who resists it, and who ultimately defines dignity in the process." And then came the ripple effect. College students shared the video in lecture halls, professors using it to spark debates about democracy and representation. Community leaders clipped it into speeches about resilience. Parents showed their children, saying, "Look at her. This is what courage looks like." For women, especially women of color, the moment carried something deeper. It was vindication, a collective exhale. Too often, they had seen people like them interrupted, diminished, told to lower their voices. Here, live on camera, was proof that dignity could silence arrogance without raising its volume. Jasmine Crockett became more than just a congresswoman in that instant. She became a symbol of possibility. For minorities, immigrants, and all those who had been told they didn't belong in America's highest institutions, it was a reminder that belonging isn't granted by those in power, it's claimed by those who refuse to be excluded. Crockett's line wasn't simply a retort, it was a declaration. And for millions, it was a declaration made on their behalf. Politicians took notice too. Some rushed to align themselves with her, quoting her words in speeches, eager to bask in the glow of her viral moment. Others retreated into silence, careful not to draw comparisons that would highlight their own lack of courage. The exchange became a litmus test. Were you with dignity, or were you with arrogance? Even celebrities joined in. Musicians tweeted lyrics inspired by her line. Actors reposted the clip with fire emojis. The cultural echo was deafening, and as the days passed, the video didn't fade. It became the reference point, the shorthand for standing firm in the face of intimidation. But beneath the noise, beyond the headlines and hashtags, something deeper stirred. Because this wasn't just a viral moment, and it wasn't just a political skirmish. It was the beginning of a shift, one that would force the country to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about respect, about who gets to speak and who gets told to stay silent. The headlines captured the spectacle, the memes captured the humor, the supporters captured the inspiration. But beyond the headlines, something deeper was at play. In the end, what unfolded between Judge Thapar and Jasmine Crockett was never just about legal sparring or political theater. It was about something much deeper, an age-old struggle between arrogance and dignity, between power that demands respect and truth that earns it. And in that chamber, before the eyes of a nation, dignity triumphed. Jasmine Crockett's refusal to be silenced was not simply a personal victory, it was a collective one. It reminded America that justice does not belong to those who shout the loudest or sit in the highest seats. Justice belongs to those who are willing to stand, unflinching, when the weight of authority leans against them. In that sense, her calm rebuttal was more than a mic drop moment. It was democracy, distilled into a single act of courage. For too long, elitism has cloaked itself in robes and titles, assuming that superiority is earned by station rather than by service. Thapar's condescension embodied that belief, the idea that one could corner, diminish, or outtalk the truth simply because of position. But Crockett shattered that illusion. She proved that justice is not impressed by arrogance. It responds to clarity, authenticity, and courage. And this is why the moment matters far beyond the walls of that chamber. Democracy is fragile, not because it lacks power, but because it depends on people willing to claim it. Every time someone like Jasmine stands tall, she strengthens the spine of the system itself. She reminds the nation that democracy breathes through the courage of its citizens, not through the authority of its elites. Her words carried resonance because they were not just hers. They were the echo of countless voices silenced before, voices told they didn't belong, voices interrupted and dismissed. When she spoke, they spoke. When she refused to yield, they stood taller. It was proof that a single act of defiance, rooted in dignity, could ripple outward into the lives of millions. And in that ripple lay the universal truth: dignity will always outlast arrogance. Arrogance may dominate the room for a moment, but dignity defines the memory. It is dignity that inspires, that teaches, that carries forward into the hearts of those who watched. It is dignity that builds the future. That is why Jasmine Crockett's stand is more than a clip, more than a trending hashtag. It is a symbol of resilience. It is a torch lit in a room where too many believed they had no light. It is the reminder that no matter how high arrogance climbs, it will always crumble when faced with truth that refuses to bend. And so the lesson is clear. Democracy does not demand perfection, nor does it require silence in the face of intimidation. It requires courage to speak when others would rather you stay quiet, the courage to meet condescension with clarity, the courage to transform a confrontation into a moment of universal truth. In that chamber, one voice stood firm, and because it did, millions found their courage. Millions remembered that arrogance is fleeting, but dignity endures. Millions saw not just a congresswoman, but a reflection of themselves, their struggles, their resilience, their right to stand unafraid in the face of power. And that is the heart of this story. When arrogance tried to corner dignity, dignity did not flinch. It rose, it spoke, and it triumphed. And in doing so, it reminded us all of the promise of democracy, not as an abstract idea, but as a living force, carried by those willing to claim it, protect it, and embody it. But even as the chamber settled, and the headlines began to fade, one final question lingered: what would this moment mean for the future of the fight for justice? Would it be remembered as a flash of defiance, or as the spark of something greater? The answer, as always, would rest with us. And so we return to the moment that started it all. Judge Amul Thapar tried to corner Jasmine Crockett, confident that his authority and sharp words would force her into silence. But instead of shrinking back, she rose higher. She didn't just win an argument, she reshaped the narrative. In a single exchange, she proved that truth doesn't need volume to be heard, and dignity doesn't need permission to stand tall. This was never just about one hearing. It was about the story of who gets to define justice in America. And Jasmine Crockett showed us that justice will never belong to arrogance. It belongs to resilience, to clarity, to the courage of those who refuse to be silenced. So as you reflect on this moment, ask yourself, what does dignity mean to you? What stories of truth and courage do you carry, waiting for the right moment to be told? Because every time someone like Jasmine stands firm, it isn't only her victory, an invitation for the rest of us to find our voice too. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why justice and representation matter, then join this movement. Subscribe to the channel, share this video, and be part of a community that believes truth deserves to win. Your voice, your share, your presence here helps amplify the values that moments like this embody. Because history is written, not just by the powerful, but by those who dare to speak against them. Jasmine Crockett reminded us of that. And as long as voices like yours continue to rise, truth will never be silenced. Because when power tries to silence truth, history shows us who really gets the last word.